The Rebel Capitalist Show. Tell me your thoughts on the real estate market.
So 40% of people have a home, or about 38% of people have a home in the sense that they own it outright. So all they have to do is pay property taxes. Let's do air quotes, because all they have to do is pay property taxes is going to be a whole different proposition in the land of tomorrow. 60% of people have a mortgage. There are 38 million Americans who are over the age of 65 who own a home. And literally on February the 19th, you can't make this up, the day that the stock market peaked, Zillow put out a huge report on this cohort of home-owning Americans, a much greater percentage of whom own their homes outright. And it's called the Silver Tsunami. Mm-hmm. And the report that Zillow put out said that we were going to have these friendly waves as the boomers and the silent generation, the older ones, we were going to have these friendly waves of selling going into the years to come, and that this acute shortage of supply problem was going to gently be resolved as the older people downsized and sold their homes. And it was going to be so nice and organized. If you look at Bloomberg Consumer Comfort, if you look at consumer sentiment among the highest earners, if you look at consumer sentiment among the oldest Americans, despite the fact that the stock market has rebounded, their sentiment has not. They're old enough to say, I see what you're doing in Washington. It's really going to end badly. The minute I feel safe enough to have an open house or go move in with my kids so that I can have an open house, I don't trust what is happening in the stock market. I don't trust what is in my IRA anymore. I'm getting the equity out of my house. And it's not going to be nice undulations. It's not going to be organized. It's going to be all of them getting out there at once and listing their homes. So we have had 5 consecutive weeks of decent recovery in purchase activity in the US housing market. Okay. You can't tell me that pre-COVID, there were not a bunch of people looking to the spring selling season with a need to buy a home. That's just a natural progression, where you've got 156 million people in the workforce.
Right.
People are going to relocate. People are going to move. People have had more kids. People need to upsize. People need to downsize. So you had a certain amount of activity that was sitting in the pipeline that had to be satisfied. But my question is, once the entire country's reopened and you've got all of these senior citizens listing their homes, and I'm being told this is not going to happen, their confidence is telling me it is going to happen, that they're not buying the rally in the stock market enough to say what they said 10 years ago. What they said 10 years ago was, I can stay in the workforce for another decade. I'm just in my 60s. The boomers. I can keep working. I like my big house. I'm not so sick that I need to be close to a hospital. I can stay out here in the boonies in my McMansion. I can afford to maintain it. All of this calculus is going to be stuck on its head because the same generation is now 10 years older. Are they going to say, well, I'm 75, so I can easily work until I'm 85? You had 1.2 million people 65 and older in March payrolls lose their jobs. Mm-hmm. That, I would argue, is going to be permanent job loss because there are going to be other people who are going to rush to take those open positions who employers are going to hire because they're cheaper than the senior citizens were. So again, you're going to have older Americans with the need to sell their homes, which we've never had despite this biggest generation. Now the millennials are bigger. Despite this biggest generation potentially having to have gone that route 10 years ago, they didn't. The stock market rebounded. Quantitative easing was a brand new thing. The rally came roaring back. The rebound was swift. They had, a tripling off the lows in their stock, and they were able to hold on. That's not going to be the case going forward for residential real estate in America. And you've had millennials as a generation lose proportionately more jobs than any other generation post COVID-19. And they have kids, they need homes, they need to buy the millennials homes, but they're in a worse situation financially than they were in pre-COVID.
And
So they
prices
can
are sky
afford
high.
less home than they could before. And the seniors are going to put their big McMansions on the market for high prices. No, the divide has to be closed by prices coming down, such that you put the willing buyers in touch with the willing sellers.
You had the opportunity to be right in the thick of things in the 1970s and see this stagflation that most of us just kind of read about. How was it to live through the 1970s when prices were going up at 6%, 10%, 12% per year? And then the next part of that question would be, have you seen similar price increases in what you buy on a day-to-day basis from 2008 to 2020?
Well, the big change, again, let's go back to the 70s, because that affects how I see it. That was 72, and then Nixon opened the door to China in 74, I believe. And then in 75, gold became, this guy named Blanchard made gold legal again in America. And so the door to China was open. So the reason we don't have much inflation, although they started printing money, was Chinese goods. Walmart shoppers love China. So the Chinese low labor costs and all that kept inflation down for, let's say, the average person. But for the professional investor, and I know, there was bubbles all over the place, right? There was the bubble that, the subprime bubble. That was massive.
Right.
And then just recently we had the subprime crash in 2019. And the average person doesn't see it. They see this bubble in the stock market. But I saw the bubble in the repo market, or the shadow market. And then the stock market kept going up. And all the idiots were rushing in. And as you know, as you get older, the higher the market, the more stupid the investor, because they come in droves. They come in droves, only to get slaughtered. I was my degree is in oil, Standard Oil. That's why I work. I drove tankers for them. I was third officer. And the way you describe it perfectly is the monetary system is nothing more than a series of pipes. That's like a massive oil refinery. All these pipes running all over the place. So every time I'm watching your programs, and I recommend your programs to everybody to understand the macro, or the invisible macro, underneath the stock market. The reason I want to thank you is because it was, your confirmation bias by, I think it was about May of last year. Everybody was running into the stock market. And then I think you were talking about the repo market. And I said, I'd better get out. And I don't flip property. I have a lot of real estate. And what we did was we had 8,000 rental units. We sold off 1,000. We sold, I hate to say this, the junk. We sold our non-performing. Do you know what I mean? We trimmed the hedge back, the stuff that wasn't performing. We just didn't foresee certain things. But because of your work and people like you on YouTube, I said, okay, I better start moving. So we sold in the summer of 2019. And then because of you started talking about the shadow banking and the repo market and MILFs and all this other stuff. And then we could see this crash. And then, as I said here, prophecy, why the biggest stock market crash in history is still coming. It came in March 2020. It went down in 3 massive steps. Yeah. And people who didn't see it got wiped out. They're being wiped out right now.
The first thing I'd really like you to explain to my viewers is it's something that the average Joe just has a really hard time understanding. And that's why currency doesn't equal purchasing power or consumption, and production and productivity does. They just see the Fed, as an example, printing this money, and they see that, well, if you deposit that money or currency into my bank account, I can buy more stuff. So doesn't that equal purchasing power? But as you've explained so many times, it doesn't. But just if you could break that down to a third grade level as to why it's all about production.
Yeah, because that's probably the level at which most U.S. high school graduates are probably reading. But your audience might be a little bit better educated than the third grade. But if you look at what's happening right now, in particular with the relief plans that are being announced regarding the coronavirus and what everybody is saying. You listen to those Democratic debates from Sunday night and Biden and Sanders. The government's going to make everybody whole. The government's going to pay your mortgage. The government's going to pay your rent. The government's going to give you health care. The government's going to make sure you don't lose any money. And everybody is like, yeah, that's great. The government could just give everybody money because everybody knows that the government creates the money, or the Federal Reserve creates the money. And for some reason, sometimes they're stingy with it. They don't want to share it, But during times of emergency, all of a sudden, they're going to give everybody some money. Mnuchin was saying today that, well, it's no fault of Americans that this happened. And so therefore, we want to make sure that nobody suffers. So we're going to give everybody money. Like the government is sitting on this pile of money. But, people don't want money per se. They want the things that they can buy with money. But the money is the cart. The stuff is the horse. You need to produce things. For money to have any purchasing power, there must be goods and services to purchase, right? In the absence of goods and services, money has no value, right? If you're stranded on a desert island and you're really thirsty and hungry and someone gives you a bunch of money, what good is it? If there's no food and there's no water, there's nothing that you could do with that money. And so for money to have value, paper money anyway, I mean, gold, real money, has intrinsic value all by itself because you could do something with gold. You could use it. But you can't do anything with paper. You have to exchange it for something. But that means that something has to exist. So it has to be produced into existence, or somebody has to expend labor to provide you with a service. And the government can print money, but they can't create products. They don't provide services that you want. The marketplace has to do that. So when the government just creates money and nobody is doing any work to add products or services into the economy, then all they're doing is destroying the value of the money you already have. Because of the new money, the existing goods and services become more expensive to the point where there's no real purchasing power created by government printing money and giving it to the populace, which is really what they're doing now. And so people have to understand that money is simply a claim to production. But if there's no production, then it's really not a claim on anything. All it does is reduce the value of the claims that already exist.
I just listened to a really cool interview that you put up on your YouTube channel. If no one's seen that, make sure you go there and subscribe. It's Alhambra Investments, I think is the name of the channel. And it really, really interesting. But one of the main topics of discussion was the unemployment rate. And I think this is really a point of confusion for a lot of average Americans, especially when you got Trump out there, well, before the cerveza sickness, tweeting that basically the economy consists of two things: the unemployment rate and the S&P 500. That's it. But you took it quite a few steps deeper. Do you want to explain kind of your research there?
Well, it all comes down to what, we've talked about, people have talked about for a long time, going back to 2008, the participation problem, which is the labor force is not what it used to be. And there's all sorts of reasons that have been given for it. Economists and central bankers have all stated that, well, as the labor force got shrunk, diminished as a percent of the overall population, that was for various structural reasons that are not related to macro factors. But yet, when you look at and analyze the labor force behavior, it's so obvious what happened. Now, in a typical recession or business cycle, the labor force itself doesn't really change. And that makes sense. It makes intuitive sense. If you're one of the unfortunate ones who are laid off from, because of a recession, you don't leave the labor force. You don't have a job, but you're still looking for work. And you probably even understand that you might be out of work for months, maybe even a year, but you expect, you intend, you're going to go back to work. And so if you look at the labor force, the trajectory of the labor force throughout all of these recessions in the post-war history, that's what happens. The labor force doesn't break. It doesn't change. It continues to grow. Even through the worst recessions we've experienced, like 1981-82, which was a really bad recession, labor force continued to grow because, again, you don't leave the labor force because of a recession. You just don't.
So when you talk about the labor force participation expanding, are you talking about the percentage or the actual number of people?
both in absolute terms and the percentage terms, because go back to the 1980s, 1970s, even the 1990s, the participation rate expanded, as did the labor force. But it didn't matter. You go back to the 1950s or even beforehand, the labor force doesn't contract. Now the job, the number of people who have jobs does. That's, people get laid off, people get thrown out of work. That's what happens in any kind of cyclical recession. But again, if you're one of those unfortunate few that are laid off, you don't leave the labor force. You realize the situation is bad, and you have to sit out of employment for a while, but you're still looking for work, which is what we define as the labor force. And that all changed in October 2008. For the first time in post-war American economic history, suddenly the labor force begins to contract. Not just the number of people who are working, but the labor force, the people who are saying they're working, that contracted. And what that meant was not only were millions and millions of people being laid off of work, something had changed where their perception was, I've just been laid off and I don't expect to go back anytime soon, so I'm not even going to look for work anymore. That was a substantial change in the behavior of the labor market that is ignored, especially by central bankers, because what happened in October 2008? I mean, the connection, it's obvious. Financial crisis of that level and that depth. I mean, you had companies like McDonald's and Caterpillar going to the Federal Reserve trying to beg it to buy its commercial paper. So, I mean, employees understood that their employers were in deep trouble. This was no normal recession. And so they said, damn, I just got laid off from my job. I don't think I'm going back to work anytime soon. So they gave up on the labor market. And from top to bottom was almost 2 million people. It doesn't sound like a lot when you're talking about 150 million workers, but 2 million people left the labor force, never mind the fact millions more who should have shown up, as population growth continued to contribute to the labor pool, they never came into it. So we had year upon year where the absolute level of the labor force stagnated, even as the number of jobs came back. And that's why the unemployment rate started to fall, was because the denominator, the labor force, was stuck, while the numerator started to climb back up in recovery, or partial recovery.
I wanted to get your opinion, because I know you've done so much research, on how gold typically performs in times of inflation or deflation in terms of its purchasing power.
Well, ironically, it appears that gold does well during any period of time when faith in the monetary system is attacked. It's more conventionally thought of course, as a mechanism for defending oneself from inflation. But it's worth noting that over 1,000 years at least, gold has been unique in that it's a medium of exchange that is also a store of value. It isn't a promise to pay, but rather payment in itself. And in some cultures over time, when the crisis of confidence occurred as a consequence of deflation, where that deflation was accompanied by illiquidity and a lack of confidence in specie or fiat currency, gold has done well too. The only real analog we have to that in recent history, of course, was the Great Depression, where gold did well as a consequence of being repriced by fiat. The suspicion is that had gold not been made illegal by Roosevelt, that the market for gold would have done very well, because trust in the financial system and trust in the US dollar at that point in time was very weak. But in fact, we didn't have the opportunity to test it because gold was repriced higher by fiat.
Right. So that brings me to one of my next questions, which is, throughout your experience, what do you see as the main driver in gold price, either up or down?
In my lifetime, it would appear that the most important determinant of the gold price is the broader market's faith or lack of faith in fiat currencies. The most important fiat currency in the world during my lifetime has been the US dollar, the de facto reserve currency of the world, by which all other financial pieces of paper have been measured during my entire career in financial services. When confidence is high in the US dollar and the US 10-year Treasury, Gold, which is primarily, in my experience, an insurance asset, is weak. Conversely, when faith in the US dollar fades, the gold price has done very well. What's interesting about the period that we're in right now, or at least what interests me, is that we have had for 18 months a strong US dollar and strong gold prices. The only time before in my career that I remember seeing this was in 2001 until mid 2002. My suspicion is that many investors worldwide regard the US dollar strength not so much as a function of a very robust US economy or faith in this administration or an administration to come, but rather the comparative strength of the US dollar relative to other fiat currencies. I also find it interesting that confidence in the dollar and other fiat currencies, confidence in the system, remains strong enough that central banks and central government controls have been able to keep interest rates artificially low, in some senses in negative terms. And my suspicion further is that the fact that both gold and the US dollar are strong simultaneously, which is a rare event, is a function really of the extraordinarily low interest rates available on savings instruments worldwide, but especially the US 10-year Treasury. If you think about the US 10-year Treasury, as of the time of this interview, I think it's yielding about 1.85, 1.87. The Congressional Budget Office suggests that the underlying inflation rate of the United States, which is a different way of saying the official rate at which the dollar is depreciating, is about 1.6%. So the value proposition offered up by the US 10-year Treasury is that the US government will pay you 15 basis points. My friend Jim Grant famously calls this return-free risk.
Right.
So what's happening from my point of view is that gold is competing with return-free risk, a fight that over time I suspect it can win.